Here we go. So the subject this evening is the Amidah, which is the central prayer. I can't remember exactly how I read the article a while ago. The central prayer of every Jewish service. In fact, if this prayer is in what we're gathering to do, it is a Jewish service. If this prayer is not there, it's not a Jewish service. So I'll give an example. Traditionally Jews meet to pray 3 times a day. So you have this prayer in every one of those services. And in fact, on Shabbat and holidays, there's an extra prayer session. So you have the prayer said an extra time. And just to make life even more complicated, in traditional services, first you say it quietly to yourself, and then the cantor repeats it. So a traditional Jew will hear this prayer 6 times a day, and 8 times on Shabbat and holidays. We get together for things that don't have this prayer. For example, Hanukkah, right? We have Hanukkah lighting and things. We don't have this prayer. It's not a service. It's a gathering, but it's not a service. We get together after Shabbat. When Shabbat ends, we may have a service for the evening first day service at the end of Shabbat, but you get together for Havdalah, you don't say this prayer because it's not a service. I think that the article is going to cover this, but the word Amidah means standing, and so it's traditional to stand during this prayer. It's also called tefillah, and I often talk about this because the word tefillah means prayer. So this prayer is also sometimes called in the Talmud ha-tefillah, the prayer. So if they're talking in the Talmud about the prayer, you don't have to ask which prayer, it's this prayer. So a lot of times in services, I will say it's like if we were talking about Elvis, you wouldn't have to ask which Elvis. It's Elvis. And it's also called the Shemona Esrei, which means 18. And of course, it has 19 sections. So that's going to be one of the interesting things we will discuss, how 18 became 19. Alan.
Two things. The Mishkan Tefillah actually has the hot tefillah. The Hebrew, the hay is right at the top of the page to make the point that you're making. It's in our.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The second question is, when you said that having the Amidah is a necessary and requirement to be a service, I was also told along the way that the Aleinu has that particular quality. Is that true? I mean, you have if you've just made for the Aleinu, you've met the minimum of coming.
So I do think it's customary to say the Aleinu at the end of every service. It is nowhere near as significant, I would say, as the Amidah.
Okay.
And just reacting to your last little comment that it's the minimum necessary, I would say minimum necessary is a concept that is foreign to Jews and prayer.
Okay.
And in fact, it's one of the things that Reform Judaism did was to try and at least cut down the repetition. So, for example, a traditional service, evening service, Saturday morning service, would have both a silent recitation of the Amidah, and we're all sort of standing and mumbling to ourselves. And actually, the rule is you say it quietly so you can understand what you're saying, but someone next to you wouldn't be able to understand what you're saying. So it's not quite silent. And then the prayer is so important that just in case you might have gotten it wrong, the cantor or the service leader repeats the entire prayer, and everyone says amen at the end of every section. And the word amen comes from the concept of emunah, which means faith. And the tradition is you say amen to a prayer that someone else has said. You don't say amen to a prayer that you say. And by saying amen, you basically adding your faith to what the person said, and you get credit for saying the prayer. But you know, in a traditional Judaism, there's lots of elements which are required, and it's one of the reasons why if you go to an Orthodox service, particularly a weekday service, they are going a mile a minute because the option to skip sections does not exist. You just go faster and faster because you got to get through it. Because a weekday you've got to get to work. Jerry.
Yeah, traditionally as well, the repetition of the Kaddish, Hati Kaddish, like 3 times in
Yeah,
a
or even more. So it's the Kaddish is actually we ought to do I think we did do a service on the Kaddish or the study of the Kaddish. The Kaddish is actually a dividing line between sections of the service. So so it's natural to repeat it because you're going from one section of the service to another section to another section. And then that would be a Chatzi Kaddish. And then there's a mourner's Kaddish. And then when you study something, you say the Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish. And then on certain occasions, and I can't remember what the rules would be, there is the Kaddish Shalem, the full Kaddish. There's even a special burial Kaddish. So again, one of the overriding principles in Reform Judaism was to try and eliminate as much as I guess could be tolerated all of these repetitions because they wanted to shorten the service and also, you know, have people dwell on what was being said and the sort of the kavanah, the intention, the spirituality of prayers, rather than rattling through it a mile a minute. Okay. Any other thoughts? I mean, I actually, and I think it's in the article actually, but I'm not sure. So I want to make this one very clear. It's something I talk about all the time. This prayer, the Amidah, is what took the place of animal sacrifice. So in temple times, there were sacrificial observances, morning, evening, morning, afternoon, and evening. And with the destruction of the temple, the rabbis ruled that basically we're not going to sacrifice animals at other places, other temples, and they substituted the recitation of the Amidah for the animal sacrifice. And it's you know, I remember distinctly on 2 occasions, I would always explain this at bar and bat mitzvahs where we're conducting a service and the child is, you know, is chanting the Amidah. And I remember twice the grandfather of the bar bat mitzvah child came up to me after the service in tears saying, I have been praying this prayer 3 times a day, every day of my life since I'm about 3 or 4 years old. And the person was in his 80s. And he said, no one ever explained to him that that was the origin of the prayer, which I think, you know, is for me, a fascinating element of Judaism where the idea is you've got to do what Jewish law tells you to do. You don't have to necessarily understand it. You don't even necessarily have to believe it. But the idea is you have to do it. So here was someone who I'm sure knew this prayer far better than I, but never had a glimmer of what the reasoning behind it was, or the reason that it was in the service. Alan, you're muted. You're muted, Alan.
But I learned from you, Rabbi, the wording slightly differently than when you just said it, which is we're obligated to do things and then learn. We don't have to learn in advance. So there's
I would say from a Jewish tradition point of view, this guy had been reciting the Amidah for 70 plus years and never knew why. So I don't think Judaism requires you to learn. What I will say, which sounds like what you're talking about, is in Judaism, you know, the ethical rules are binding. The ritual rules, like prayer and keeping kosher and doing those kinds of things, you should study them and learn them and decide whether or not God is speaking to you in those. But in traditional Judaism, there is no need to learn why you're doing anything.
But there's some place in the Torah, and maybe I can't remember Talmud, where we it helps us learn by doing things. I think is the principle, right? So when there's an obligation and you do it, even before you learn why, it does actually, from the way I've understood the practice, the tradition.
I don't disagree with that as a principle, but I can tell you that for many Jews, they have no idea what they're praying.
Well, that's not that's probably true, but that wasn't my point. That there's a kind of a lesson that I'm accrediting to you, even if you're not agreeing with me, that that years ago, this idea that we have obligations to do things first, we always have that, and eventually we learn why.
Yeah, or we may never know why. Why can't we eat milk with meat? Why can we not wear a garment made with linen and wool? It's in the Torah, but the reason for it is never explained. Why should we keep our heads covered? I don't think anybody really knows the reason why we keep our heads covered.
Some of those things can be linked to text, but the wool and linen thing never doesn't make any sense. But it probably had some historical biblical practice that.
Oh, it's in the Bible, but no one has any. I've never heard a good idea, other than the ranchers and the cowboys should be friends, a la Oklahoma. That linen is from farmers and wool is from ranchers, but that's as close as I've ever heard to a rational explanation. So Helena and then Erwin.
Yeah, so when I first started studying Judaism in depth, I learned La'aseh v'nishma. You do it, and then maybe later you understand it. That expression.
Except the expression, which is from the Torah, which is we will do it and then we will hear it. It doesn't necessarily mean we'll even understand it. So basically what the congregation was saying to God at Sinai is, we'll do whatever you say. Now tell us what we're supposed to do, which is, a wonderful statement of fealty and faith. Erwin. You're muted, Erwin. We can't hear you.
You're always muting me.
No, I never mute you. Like sometimes when you get a phone call, I will mute you. I will confess that.
Oh, yeah. No, I disagree with this assumption. In my point of view, I pray every morning and then every night. I put tefillin on, and sometimes I start putting tefillin on, and I don't feel the connection, and I stop putting it on because I don't want to fool myself, and I don't want to fool God that I am doing this because just because I have to do it. I don't believe in that. And that's the reason, for instance, I don't go 6 o'clock in the morning to Chabad to pray because they rattle the whole thing off and they don't have any feeling or anything into it. And I want to feel it when I am saying it.
So
and
what I would comment is, I agree with you. I respect your opinion. I think your opinion is absolutely rational, but it is not traditional Jewish. Traditional Jewish is just do it, a la Nike.
You really think that God cares if I am traditional Jewish or Orthodox Jewish or any, as long as I make a connection with Him and I'm a better man for that day. That's the reason.
So what I would say is, I would never hesitate. I would never jump to my opinion of what God thinks. But what I'll point out is the following, an example that might make sense. You're obligated to give tzedakah. You're obligated to feed hungry people, whether or not you feel it that morning or not. Because whether or not you feel it that morning or not, charity needs to be collected and hungry people need to be fed. and it doesn't matter what you feel. So so I would say that sense extends to all of Jewish law. We have been commanded to do things. They are commandments, they're not suggestions. I'm now not talking about Reform Judaism. And in Jewish tradition, you say it whether or not you're feeling it. I mean, the ultimate example of this, by the way, is the story about in the concentration camps, 3 rabbis get together as a Beit Din, a Jewish court, to try God on an accusation of crimes against humanity, and to find out whether God is guilty or not of crimes against humanity. And they meet and they discuss it and they convict God of crimes against humanity. And then at the end of the session, they go to afternoon prayers where they're worshiping and glorifying God, because that's required. So I would just say, I respect your opinion. I agree with it, but I would never present it as traditional Jewish. Okay, so how about if we go to the article on the Amidah? Okay, so this is an article from my Jewish Learning. I think it's actually a pretty good article. So would someone like to read?
I'll read if no one wants it, Rabbi.
Thank you, Joanne.
All right. The Amidah, moving from praise to petition to thanksgiving. The Amidah inculcates a sense of connection to God. The Amidah is the core of every Jewish worship service and is therefore also referred to as Ha-Tefillah, or the prayer. Amidah, which literally means standing, refers to a series of blessings recited while standing.
And it's actually true. It's a series of blessings because they're all very much involving the phrase Baruch Atah Adonai.
Okay, so find a version of the Shabbat.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, there's a link here you can use it.
All right.
Okay.
Using the image of master and servant, the rabbis declared that a worshiper should come before his or her master first with words of praise, then should ask one's petitions, and finally should withdraw with the words of thanks. Thus, every Amidah is divided into 3 central sections: praise, petitions, and thanks.
And I want to actually, it's sort of something that really struck me. You know, you hear from me all the time. Sonia grew up in Morocco, in Casablanca. And in Casablanca, the Jewish community adores the king of Morocco. And, and his father and grandfather and so on. The king saved the Jews from the Nazis that in Morocco. But anyway, he is loved by the Jewish community. And I once came across a letter that Sonia's mother wrote the king. And I think it was about a fairly mundane issue of real estate or something. But in the opening paragraphs of the letter, there was praise. And it struck me that the Amidah is sort of copying that. We are going before the King of Kings. And so it is appropriate to begin that, whether or not, it's rational or logical that you're going before God. Does God need to be sort of admired by praise, particularly it's written down in a prayer book and we have to read it? It's another whole interesting subject. But it is kind of like this thing, praise. The first section of the Amidah is generalized praise. It's ancestry, actually. That was it. Sonia's mother wrote about her parents and her parents and the king and the king's parents and the king's grandparents. And the opening section of the Amidah is the Avot. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. And then the second paragraph of the Amidah talks about the power of God. And it just struck me how Sonia's mother's letter followed that sort of structure. Okay, sorry for that digression, but digression is what I do. So originally,
Jewish prayer was largely unstructured. Although the rabbis eventually codified the format and themes of each of the blessings, it was initially left to the creativity of individual prayer leaders to generate the specific wording of the blessings. Individual communities in different countries began to settle on somewhat standard versions of the prayers over time. Today, the variations between the traditional texts of the Amidah in different communities are fairly minor. The Amidah is recited silently by all members of a congregation or by individuals praying along, and then in communal settings, repeated aloud by the prayer leader or cantor, with the congregation reciting Amen. To all
And-
the blessings.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
All
off.
right, to all the blessings of the Amidah.
Yeah, and you know, in Ashkenazi tradition and Sephardic tradition, you will find very slight variations, and even in certainly in Reform version of the Amidah, you will find slight variations. They're significant theologically, but unless you're really looking for them, you might miss them. And one of the things I plan to do, I hope I have time to do this, is in subsequent Monday evening sessions to really start digging into the text of the prayers, you know, on PowerPoint. And it occurred to me I ought to be doing comparison between Reform, let's say conservative and Orthodox versions of these prayers. And then there's, of course, there's a difference between morning, afternoon, and evening versions of the prayers. Okay, let's continue. First three blessings.
The first three blessings of praise of the Amidah in every worship service are always the same, with only minor variations for weekdays, Shabbat, and holidays. The first blessing is called Avot, Hebrew for ancestors, and serves as an introduction to the God of our biblical heritage, connecting us to the divine. Immediately before reciting the Amidah, the tradition developed of taking 3 steps backward and then forward again to symbolize entering into God's presence. Mentioning the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in liberal congregations, the matriarchs Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, this blessing praises God for remembering their good actions and by implication, asking God to hear our prayer favorably because of their merit. The blessing begins and ends with a formal bow at the knees and hips, symbolically demonstrating our subservience to God.
Yeah, there is a concept in Judaism called zechut avot. Zechut means merit. Avot is the ancestors. So there's this idea that when we're asking God for stuff, it's if our own merit is not worthy of receiving these benefits of you know God's beneficence, we remind God that we had terrific ancestors, and we should you know at least share in their zechut, in their merit. Okay, second blessing.
Second blessing of praise is called Gevorah, might, which describes those powers which are only within the purview of the divine. Your loving kindness sustains the living. Your great mercies gives life to the dead. Articulating a fundamental rabbinic belief in resurrection, this blessing is a reminder of God's absolute power of life and death.
And as we'll see when we discuss this further, in a traditional, I would say Orthodox and conservative statement of the Gevurah, at the end we say Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim. Blessed are you, Adonai, you revive the dead. And Reform Judaism got away from that as a theological centerpiece. So in Reform Judaism, we say Mechayeh HaKol. And in the latest version of the prayer book, there's in parentheses, you can choose the version that you want. Jerry.
Yeah, I've noticed that, of course, we do the 3 steps back and then forward in Yizkor, in not just Yizkor, in
At the end of the Kaddish.
Kaddish. Yeah, and I did not realize that it was done as well in the
So
Amidah.
as I understand this, you're supposed to take 3 steps forward at the beginning of the Amidah. But if you're standing in a narrow pew, how do you do that unless you back up? And so the idea is that, and again, as the article suggested, we're approaching God's throne. And then at the end of Kaddish, we're withdrawing from God's throne. So yeah, many people know the 3 steps backward at the end of Kaddish, but not so much at the beginning. That's
Right.
good to point out. Okay.
The final blessing of this opening section of praise is called the Kedushah, or holiness. There are two versions of this prayer, one when recited silently by individuals, the other, much longer, is a series of prayers and responses by the leader and congregation when the Amidah is repeated on behalf of the community.
And in the Kedusha and also in other parts of the Amidah, the morning version is different than the afternoon and evening version. And the silent version, as they mentioned, is also different. Jerry, I don't know if you still have your hand up, but if not, you can lower it. Okay, let's continue both of these prayers.
Both of these prayers emphasize the holiness and sacred nature of God. The individually recited version simply states, "Holy are you, and holy is your name. Holy are they who praise you daily." The core of the communally repeated blessing is derived from the biblical prophet Isaiah's version of God in the heavenly temple surrounded by the angels singing praises.
Okay, let's go through that. Isaiah.
Isaiah described the angels calling one to another, echoing the phrase, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole world is filled with his glory."
And you may remember this from services. It's Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Malo Kol Ha'aretz Kivodo. And there's the tradition of getting up on your toes with every Kadosh. And I always explain it, the way I learned it is that we're trying to get up there, actually not with angels, but with seraphim. Seraphim are heavenly divine body creatures that are burning. Saraf means to burn. So they're kind of, I don't know if they are technically angels. I don't think they're interchangeable with angels, but that's the reason we go up on our toes. And continue this verse.
This verse was introduced by claiming that the human chorus of voices imitates the heavenly chorus, and thus, in a choreography designed to reflect angels, individuals rock upon the balls of their feet 3 times for each word holy that is said, symbolizing the fluttering of the angels who recited this line of praise. Several more biblical verses are also recited, ending in the blessing, "Praised are you, Adonai, the holy God."
And while I'm thinking of it, there are differences in versions of prayers for morning, afternoon, and evening, and also for different holidays. So during the high holidays, actually from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, certainly for Rosh Hashanah services and Yom Kippur services, but also for all the services in between, instead of saying Baruch Atah Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh, the Holy God, we say Baruch Atah Adonai HaMelech HaKadosh, the Holy King, the Holy King. And again, one of the themes of the high holidays is enthroning God as a king who is sitting in judgment on us.
But isn't that always
Isn't what always?
we're being judged?
I would say as a general matter, yes. But in the liturgy, we say Ha'el HaKadosh, except during the 10 Yamim HaNorim, the 10 days of awe, we say HaMelech HaKadosh. And there's other insertions in the Amidah, you know, about being in the book of life, and there's
Of course.
in the Amidah. I should probably remember to take a look at that too. Differences in the high holidays, and you will see if you open a prayer book, it'll say, you know, during the 10 days of awe, read this paragraph or substitute this for that.
Very good.
And one thing, and again, I'll emphasize, every Jewish service follows the same basic structure. Every Jewish service follows the same basic structure. There are changes as a function of time of day. Evening services have a different prayer about nature than morning and afternoon services do. There's a different prayer for peace for a time of day. There's differences in the Amidah as a function of time of day, and then different holidays will change. So we talked about the section called the Kedusha about holiness. On Yom Kippur, the Kedusha in a traditional service is about 2 hours long. So instead of just a simple phrase, that portion for Yom Kippur morning service completely blows up and expands and talks about the 10 martyrs and everything else. But the basic structure is the same. I didn't realize this you know, until I was going to services as an adult for about 10 years, all of a sudden it hit me that all the structure is always the same. Sort of made me wonder why nobody pointed this out. But nobody did. Middle section.
On weekdays, the middle section of the Amidah consists of 13 blessings that are individual and communal requests to God. Originally consisting of only 12 petitions, the number of blessings recited was 18. Hence, an early synonym for the Midah was the Shemona Esri, or the 18. However, in rabbinic times, another blessing was added, resulting in a total of 19. Yet, the original name of the Shemona Esri was retained.
Yeah,
Of
and there's
these-
actually even controversy about which is the one that was added. So one good candidate is about not only rewarding the good guys, but punishing the bad guys. Some people think that was the one that was added, and there are other scholars that believe different other ones were added. Alan.
I'm trying to remember where I learned this, but this idea of freedom from slavery from Egypt and Mitzrayim, I know that's in the Mikamocha, but is there some reference in every prayer that we were freed from slavery from Egypt?
Well, certainly not in every prayer.
God,
Yeah, every service. I don't mean every prayer. Every
Um,
not every service, but every Shabbat.
Well, no. I mean, that wasn't the question. So Michamocha is in the morning, in morning services and evening services. It's not in the afternoon service, interestingly enough, because it's part of the prayers surrounding the Shema. And in the text in Deuteronomy of the Shema, it says you say this in the morning. It says you say it when you rise up and when you lie down. So the rabbi said that's part of the morning service and the afternoon service. So Michamocha is morning and evening. I think in a full Orthodox service, there's a lot more, and my guess is that it is actually mentioned in every service, but it's certainly not every prayer. Yes.
I didn't mean prayer. Sorry, my
Yeah.
Jessica.
Okay. Bryce.
Isn't it always morning somewhere in the world? And so
Yes.
somebody is always saying morning prayers, and at the same time, it's always in the middle of the day somewhere. So God is getting constantly barraged with morning, afternoon, and evening prayers from all over the world in a cacophony. He's tough guy.
But Jews are only 0.2% of the world.
But they're distributed pretty. It's like leavening.
Well,
Okay.
actually, it's not so true. You take Asia, there are very few Jews in all of China, and and India. But anyway, I mean, I know occasionally you make this point that how can God possibly pay attention to all the prayers? So I would give you a overly simplistic answer is that if God is God, it's not a problem. Maybe a equally simplistic answer is the prayers are not for God, they're for us. But anyway, I don't find a theological problem for that. And yeah, I mean, you say prayers according to your time of day. And there's actually issues about, suppose you're in space, right? I don't know if you're worried about this one. You're a traditional Jew and you're in space. And what time do you say morning, afternoon, and evening prayers? And the answer actually is, maybe Alan, you know the answer?
No,
Every 90 minutes.
worse than being in space is being with the ultra Orthodox on an airplane, getting up on a international flight to Israel.
I don't know why that's worse than being in space.
Well, because it's 90 minutes if you're going around the globe, but there's some way, and I do this with some respect. They know that it's not sunset and sunrise, but they know when to get up because it's not obvious.
No,
by
but but the answer is actually, there is not a particular time, and this is an important point, that you have to say the Amidah. You have to say the Amidah in a range of time, and I can't remember in the Talmud what it is. You can't say it before you have enough light to distinguish a blue thread from a white thread. The opening of Berachot in the Talmud discusses this. From what time can you start saying the Amidah? And then there's a point in which it's too late to say morning services, and now you say afternoon services. So what will happen on a plane, and I have been part of these, is, at some point in the morning, traditional Jews will gather, because you need to pray these things in a minyan. So if they have a minyan, they will gather and pray the morning prayer and pray the afternoon prayer. It depends how long the service is. But the answer is, if you're in space, you go with your home clock. So if you're from Detroit, you would go according to the Detroit clock, and Jerusalem, and so on. That's my understanding.
To Bryce's point, if I can go back to that, wasn't a lot of these things based on the fact that really was just everything was in Israel and there wasn't multiple time zones. So morning, afternoon, and evening were very structured because you're all always in Israel.
Yeah, but I would say everything relating to prayer is Talmudic. So by the time of the Talmud, there's a diaspora in Egypt and Greece and Rome. We're not going by God's clock, or going by our own clock. I think that's the main point. Okay, there is actually a joke about they have the proverbial priest, minister, and rabbi go into space and are orbiting the Earth. And at the news conference, they ask him, tell us of your reaction. And the priest and the minister both go on eloquently about seeing space and the beauty of space and the Earth from the capsule, and how magnificent it was. And the rabbi said, "Who had time to look out the window? Every 90 minutes, it's on with that tefillin, off with that tefillin, on with that tefillin, off with that
Yeah,
tefillin."
I remember that.
Okay, but
Yeah.
let's continue. I don't know where we are.
Of these 13 requests recited during the weekday Amidah, the first 5 are essentially personal or individual requests to God to improve the situation of each person. The individual prays to God to grant us intelligence and understanding, give us the ability to repent of our transgressions, for God to be gracious and forgiving, to send a Redeemer or Messiah to the Jewish people to end our affliction, and finally, to grant healing to those who are sick and ailing. Despite the individual nature of these requests, the language of the prayers are all in the plural, emphasizing the corporate nature of even singular Jewish identity.
Yeah, so about that, instead of saying heal me, we would say heal us. Rafa'inu v'nirafe. Heal us and we will be healed. But the first, whatever the number is, the first group is about our personal lives. And then, as we'll see, the next group is more on corporate Judaism, corporate Israel. So let's talk about the following 8 blessings.
The following 8 blessings are focused more explicitly on the communal and national needs of the Jewish people. There is a request for rain or dew in the proper season to ensure agricultural bounty, a plea to end the dispersion of the Jewish people, and prayers to restore true judges and establish justice in the world. To humble the arrogant and those who seek to malign and injure the Jewish community, to sustain the righteous of the house of Israel, rebuild Jerusalem, reestablish a Davidic leadership, and a final petition to hear and answer the prayers of the Jewish people. On Shabbat and holidays, instead of requests that might distract us by reminding us of our physical and national wants and needs, the rabbis established the middle section as an opportunity to celebrate the holiness of the Sabbath, day and/or the festival. On Shabbat morning, the entire middle section of the Amidah describes Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, followed by the verses from the book of Exodus 31:16-17, that describe the observance of Shabbat as a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. Furthermore, Shabbat is summarized as a gift given only to the Jews out of God's love for his people. It concludes with a blessing, thanking God for sanctifying the Shabbat.
And I would also editorialize on this, and that is the 13 intermediate blessings, which are only recited on weekdays, are not recited on Shabbat. On Shabbat, we talk about the holiness of Shabbat. And my understanding on that is that On Shabbat, we pretend that we don't have any of these needs. We don't need healing. We don't need food. We don't need rain in its time. We are pretending, at least for one day, that the world is perfected and there's no need to ask God for anything. And then, of course, back to the weekday, we are back to making these requests.
On festivals, particularly the pilgrimage holidays of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the middle portion of the Amidah similarly describes how God has given these holidays as a gift to the Jewish people for joy and celebration. There are also references to the biblical patriarch King David and Jerusalem to be remembered in glory. Despite the official absence of requests, the holiday prayers of Midah do in fact ask that God enable us to enjoy and celebrate the holiday with gladness of heart and conclude with a blessing, thanking God for sanctifying the people of Israel and the holiday.
And again, as a matter of practice, you just have some extra verses in these prayers during those three holidays.
The final section. The final section of every Amidah concludes with blessings of thanksgiving to God. Like the first three blessings, these are identical for weekday, Shabbat, and holiday versions of the Amidah. The first of these is called Avodah, which means service, referring to the service of animal sacrifices in the days of the temple. This prayer asks that God accept our prayers, as were the animal sacrifices of old, and concludes by thanking God for ultimately restoring God's presence to Zion, referring to both the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem.
And again, it's always worth repeating that the word avodah in Hebrew has many meanings. It's just sometimes just called plain good old-fashioned work is called amidah. I would say broadly translating it as service is a good one, because the word eved, which comes from the same root, means servant or slave. We sing, in Passover, we sing Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh. So basically, when we talk about services, a generic term for services in the synagogue is avodah. And so just as we were serving God breakfast, lunch, and dinner in temple times, namely 3 offerings of food and grain and so on, now we're serving God the offering of our lips rather than the offering of our flocks.
The second concluding prayer of thanksgiving is called Hadoah, or thanks. This prayer thanks God for the gift of our lives and for the daily miracles which God bestows upon the world each day. The beginning and end of this prayer are marked by a bow at the hips, once again symbolizing the depth of our gratitude to God. At this point, during the reader's repetition of the Amidah, the reader recites the threefold priestly blessing, with the congregation responding, "So may it be God's will," after each line. "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his favor to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift his favor unto you and give you peace."
And again, in a traditional Amidah, this is going to be every day, 3 times a day. And in Reform world, we really have this on high holidays. We don't include it in the standard Amidah, again, to save time.
This is reminding me, what I just read is reminding me when during the month of Elul, when I say this blessing every day, does that sound familiar?
It's Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yisem lecha l'shalom. I can't remember, a week or 2 ago, we talked about this because the text of this prayer was actually found in an amulet in Israel, and it's actually on a silver foil in ancient Hebrew lettering, which is at least, I think they said it's at least 2,500 years old. So it's very, very common prayer. And the phrase after each of these 3 phrases is Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be his will. They're saying God's will here. Keep the gender out of it.
Okay. Although customs vary, traditional synagogues outside of Israel have the congregants who are Kohanim of the priestly family. ascend and invoke God's blessing upon the congregation by reciting this blessing on the holidays. In Israel, this is done every Shabbat, and in Jerusalem every day.
So this set of blessings from Numbers begins by saying, actually, if I click on this link, oh, it's going to take, I shouldn't have done it this way. Whoops, sorry. So we're looking at Safaria now. Everybody see Safaria at the moment? Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is from the book of Numbers, and God, it says, God spoke to Moses, speak to Aaron and his sons, thus shall you bless the people of Israel, say unto them, and then you have the threefold blessing. So I'm going to back up, and it always, now we'll go back to the very beginning of this article. Yeah, let me go back down to page 3. And blow it up a little bit. So, so there is this tradition, I'm going to call on Bethany in a second, of that this blessing should be given by the priests, namely people who trace themselves back to Aaron, and they would basically be prepared and assisted by the Levites in the congregation, and they would go to the front of the congregation, have a talit over their head, and they would hold their hands out with this characteristic splitting of the fingers, which many people say is really associating the letter Shin, which is one of the the initial for the word Shaddai. And then this was said to be a moment of such power that people in the congregation would turn away from them so as not to actually see God, because there's a sort of idea that the Shekhinah presence is now in the congregation. So since, again, the tradition is you don't see God, you're not allowed to actually see God, so you turn away. And some of you may know that Leonard Nimoy, when he was called upon to invent a Vulcan salute, came up with this because he was raised as an Orthodox Jew and was very much familiar with the power thereof. Bethany, you need to unmute. And
I was going to ask do you know off the top of your head, when did that become a blessing that we say over our children for Shabbat? Like at what point?
actually, the traditional blessing of children is not that blessing. The traditional blessing for boys is may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. And the traditional blessing of girls is may you be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. I actually don't know that that is in traditional Judaism used as a blessing. I would absolutely use it as a blessing. And it's very interesting. I had this experience again a week ago when I did a Persian wedding in I actually happened to be in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. But in Persian weddings, I've had the experience, which I think I've only had in Persians, coming up to me, Persian Jews, and saying, I'm going through this problem, Rabbi, bless me. And I remember the first couple of times people have done this, I didn't know what to do. And then I adopted this blessing as something, because they don't know the Hebrew anyway. So no matter what I say, they're going to be happy to be blunt about it. But I absolutely use this as a general all-purpose blessing. I use it all the time. But traditionally only Aaron and his sons, namely Kohanim, and I am not a Kohen, would actually use the blessing. So
I'll have to look it up because in the a few different resources, but predominantly PJ Library, they have us say the portion that you spoke, but then we say this as well. And I sing it in a certain way that I found a recording of that my son loves. So he actually asks me to sing it to him every night before bed too. And
I wouldn't discourage you from doing that. I don't know that it is traditional, but it should be. I have
in our
zero
house
problem.
it is at least.
Right. If enough of us keep doing it, it will be traditional. Alan.
So this Persian practice that you referred to makes me wonder whether it has some Sephardic practice.
Oh yeah, I would think so, and I would also think. Now I'm just sort of guessing, but Sephardim and Persians are more influenced by mysticism and this sort of almost like, I will call it a magical power of blessings.
But there's the other thing that goes through my mind, partly because of my tangential connection to Christians, is that it also feels like what Christians might say.
Yes, and one of the things where I've had a wonderful time in interfaith settings is particularly Catholic settings, and I've spoken to very large Catholic groups, and I will attend the Mass. And as you know, when you attend the Mass, you go up and you have some wine and you have the wafer, and it is always announced beforehand, if you're not Catholic or you don't want that, cross your hands in front of you. So the priest, knows that he's not going to offer you the wine and the wafer. So I once went up, and I think it was a local bishop, gave me the blessing. And what he said in English was what we just read. And then I asked him, I said, Father, can I bless you? And then so he put his hands down and I put my hands up like this, and I gave him the same blessing in Hebrew. And it was a great moment of interfaith. I imagine the Orthodox authorities would be rolling over in their graves, but it was very powerful. Cheryl.
So I got my Mishkan Tefillah, my Reform Sidur out, since I usually just do Saturday, Friday, Saturday services. It's for the Shabbat one. So my question to you is, I'm on page 46 where it says Tefillah.
Hang on, let me get mine. Hold on.
Get yours.
It says hot tefillah, right? Not just tefillah. To Rabbi's point, hot tefillah.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, if you do the Hebrew, yes, you're right. There's a ha there.
That was for those of you who think that's just a virtual background. So page 46, yes?
46. So my question is, in this article, where are we beginning these prayers? Because I often I often look at the left-hand side in the English because it has the sections. Avod, road.
Yeah. You're nowhere near it. Oh, I'm looking now at the week. I have the wrong one. Yeah, this is weekdays and festivals. Hold on. That's for weekdays.
No, you need Shabbat.
Sorry about that. Okay, 46. Hold on, find it. And I'm going to actually do this. Okay, so on page 46, you can see it says Tefillah in big letters. We're going to go through this actually at a later time. So that's a little prayer before you start saying this prayer, is on 46.
So this is before you start saying the Amidah.
Yes, but it's sort of an introduction to the Amidah.
Okay.
And then the actual Amidah starts on 48.
Yeah, because that's where the patriarchs and the matriarchs.
That's where the Avot are, yes.
Yep. And that's
then,
where it does say on page 49 in English, it says Avot.
Right. And then page 48, it says it in Hebrew.
Right.
And all the other sections. It's kind of nice in this prayer book. I'm gonna actually do this in future weeks. We're gonna keep talking about the Amidah, about how the prayer book works, and yes. So that answers your question, I presume?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to know where it actually begins in here.
Yes. Okay, good. And now I think although customs may vary.
Oh, I think I read that, no?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it's the
Okay,
final
so let's go to, you did. The final prayer.
Okay, the final prayer of thanksgiving to God is actually a final petition to bestow justice, mercy, and peace on the world. Called Shalom, or peace, the community asks that God grant peace, goodness, blessing, and compassion upon everyone. The themes and language are clearly derived from the priestly blessing that precedes it. A different but parallel version of this prayer is recited in the afternoon and evening Amidah prayers.
Yeah, so morning, it seems Shalom, and afternoon and evening, it's Shalom Rav. So both are prayers for peace, different version in the morning and the evening.
Although the official structure of the Amidah concludes with the prayer for peace, the rabbis of antiquity added on private personal meditations. The fairly standard version, which appears in most Siddurim prayer books, is the concluding meditation of Mar Bar Ravina from the time of the Talmud, Barachat 17a.
Yeah, I actually find this amusing. So they instituted personal quiet prayer, and then they presumably the rabbis would worry that we wouldn't do it right. So they actually gave us a text for personal private prayer, which I generally ignore. Okay, I think we're almost done.
However, it is appropriate for individuals to recite their own prayers as well as this point. The Amidah then formally concludes with the recitation of the line, "May God who brings peace to the universe bring peace to us and all of the people, Israel. Amen." This is recited while taking 3 steps backward, bowing to both sides, and taking 3 steps forward again, formally retreating from God's symbolic presence.
Okay, and I think that's the end of the article, and we're just about at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to stop sharing and just invite any other comments. Cheryl, you still have your hand up. I don't know if that, now it's down. Okay. Chris.
Yeah, I was wondering, is it standard for like synagogues today to have like 3 actual services where this happens?
I would say every Orthodox service, every Orthodox community will have 3 services a day. Whether they will have it at every one of their synagogues is a question, because you're supposed to have a minyan. So, for example, with Chabad, my guess is, I actually don't know if this is true, if you have a bunch of different Chabads in an area, they might designate one for morning and afternoon and evening services. And so typically what will happen is you have a service in the morning at a time that people can attend and still get to work. So it might be 7 in the morning in our area. And then there will typically be a service just before sunset. That would be the afternoon service, immediately followed by the evening service. And then, I lived in Jerusalem for a year and actually, worked in Jerusalem for various Israeli companies. And if you have a big company like a factory, and one of the companies I worked for had a factory, there will be a little synagogue on site, and there will be, not all the people working in the company are going to be traditional and pray 3 times a day, but there will be a synagogue, and there will be an announcement that, afternoon prayers are being said. I remember once being in a dentist's chair when in Jerusalem, and on the intercom for the building, they said, "Mincha, mincha, mincha." Afternoon prayers are going on now. So so that's the tradition. Interestingly, in conservative Judaism, we are commanded to pray 3 times a day. And one of the things that I found a little strange about conservative Judaism is I don't know, I personally don't know any conservative synagogues where there are 3 services a day. Maybe very large ones in Los Angeles and large cities. So to really be a good conservative Jew, you need to find an Orthodox synagogue to pray. And quite often what you'll hear is someone saying Kaddish for a year or 11 months for a parent will go to an Orthodox synagogue morning, afternoon, and evening, or maybe just morning to pray. In a traditional setting, when people are sitting Shiva, when they're observing Shiva, they will have the community come morning to do a morning prayer, and then late in the afternoon prayers, and then evening prayers every day. But I would say in the Reform world, it is practically, I don't know any Reform synagogue that have prayers 3 times a day. I've never even heard of a Reform synagogue that has prayers 3 times a day.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
Is there, like in my Christian upbringing, prayer always meant, like there was no pre-written prayers, or that's the wrong word, but there's no prayers that were traditions like this? Yeah.
Whoops. God just got you for that. You just froze right as you were repeating that particular blasphemy, but at least on my screen you did.
Is there an idea in in synagogue services today, or even just in like this, like if you guys were all hanging out together, would it be common or really never to have prayers that were just from your own words?
So what I
kind of
would say is, I mean, there are standard prayers in Christianity. The best known one is the Lord's Prayer. And I would say there are liturgies in many Christian settings, particularly the Catholic and Orthodox, where you're following a set order. In Judaism, in the Talmud, the rabbis, and they actually use the phrase in the Talmud, minted prayers. So when you had discharged your obligation to pray. At the end of the Amidah, as was mentioned, there's a moment for quiet prayer, silent prayer. There are other prayers. There is Mishaberach, a prayer for healing, but there's a standard form. Generally speaking, in Judaism, there is a standard form for any prayer which would be required. You certainly can add words of prayer, at any time, but none of those prayers come under the rubric of mandatory prayers that are required at a particular time. If the prayer is mandatory, the rabbi's worried that we get it right, and so they fix the form. So a classic example is before you eat, you say a motzi, right? You don't say what you would see normally in a Christian setting, bless this food and make us mindful of the gifts we're receiving and the people that labored in the fields. I mean, there's a beautiful sentiments to be said, but they are, and I don't think there's any prohibition against saying that in a Jewish setting. But you have to say the prayers that are minted, that are required to be said. Okay, Erwin and then Alan. Erwin, you're muted. You're muted, Erwin.
Your fault, Rabbi. Okay, I just want to ask you, it's very interesting when first thing I wake up in the morning, I say the Moda Ani, but when before I put on the tefillin and I pray, and then I say the Shema. And interestingly enough, because I am alone, only in Shema they require to say El Melech Neaman, because I am saying it by myself. But I don't know how come I don't have to say it before the Amidah or before I put on the tefillin.
You don't have to say what before? I'm lost.
It says before I say the Shema, because I am not with the minyan, say El Melech Neaman.
Oh, yeah, that's an acrostic, which means amen, not an acrostic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know the reasons behind that, because I'm not part of a community that worries about that. But I know that traditionally to say the Shemona Esrei, the prayer that we've been talking about, you must say it in a minyan. If you're in a group which doesn't have a minyan, or you're by yourself, you say it only quietly.
Yeah. I know.
Alan.
Two things. When you made the statement, Rabbi, that very few or no Reform synagogues actually have daily 3 prayers a day. I think that has led to the missing part where people want to say Kaddish for Yortzeit.
Yes.
For which I believe the Reform practice is that you use the Shabbat Kaddish after the calendar time of the Yortzeit. If you go through, at least my experience has been, if when at least in the Hebrew, in my parents, let's say, when they're on file with my synagogue, and they tell me which Shabbat they're going to say your Kaddish, it's going to be the Friday night and Saturday after the date they have.
So So what's going on is, if you're at a service, the mourner's Kaddish is actually recited in a traditional service, I think 3 times in every service. And if you're either in Shiva, Shloshim, or or observing a yahrzeit, you would rise and say that prayer. So now if your Kaddish occurs on a Wednesday, if a yahrzeit occurs on a Wednesday, so the practice in Reform Judaism is to send out a notice that will be reading the name of your loved one on the following Friday. I think some communities do it the preceding Shabbat, some do it the following Shabbat. Clearly, neither one is complying with traditional Jewish law, but that is very much the practice.
And I had one other unrelated question. I just returned, as some of you know, from 3 weeks in Israel. And in March, when I came back, I had collected a series of pictures and discussion. And we did that at the end of one of your classes. So I haven't organized this yet because I only been back a few days, but I wanted to raise the question whether there was an interest in doing that at the end of one of your Monday or Wednesday class.
I'll just ask folks, if you're interested, raise your hands. And maybe it's not fair because we can see you. So yeah, I see some interest. So what I would say is, Alan, email me a paragraph about what you plan to do, and then I'll tack it on the end of one of the programs.
Okay.
And so if people have other things they need to get to, they can leave. And if they
like last time. Okay,
yeah.
so I'm still going through. I'm not ready yet, but I'd like to be timely, which would be in the next week or two, that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, and I'll also mention this Wednesday night. Also, this Friday night, I'm going to be on the pulpit at Adat Elohim, and I'm sure those services are broadcast as well as live, and I'm going to be speaking about Lashon Hara.
Rabbi?
Yes.
This Friday, I'm gonna be in that small, tiny shul in Bozeman, Montana.
Oh.
Where you were a rabbi.
Oh, give them my regards.
Okay.
I love that shul. Yes.
Yeah,
so,
I'm gonna visit my grandson.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, some of the folks there will remember me, not all.
Okay.
Okay.
You're unforgettable, Michael.
Well, only if. Well, thank you for the presumption. I'll assume you mean that in a favorable sense, but that's my sense of optimism. But clearly, there's a lot of folks there that came after my time.
Yeah, it's a very nice community. My grandson is invited several times to Jewish families for dinner.
Yes, it's a wonderful community, and it's actually typical of Jewish communities where there aren't a lot of Jews. The Jews tend to stick together. So now there is a Chabad in Bozeman. When I was there as a student, there was no Chabad, and it was the only Jewish game in town.
I don't remember there. Right now there is a young woman rabbi there.
Yes, her name is actually, I think it's Sonia. Yes. Okay. Well, take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, I wanted to leave you with a quick humorous definitional joke.
Okay.
To pray, to ask that the laws of the universe be annulled on behalf of a single petitioner, confessedly unworthy.
Yeah, I absolutely disagree with that definition of prayer. And I would never use it. In fact,
no, it's a joke.
Oh, okay.
It's a joke.
It's close enough to what people think that
that's why it's funny.
Okay. All righty. So on that funny note, I will wish you all a good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.